Ambassador Velthrix had served the Galactic Confederation for over 60 standard years, and during that time, he had welcomed 47 different species into their alliance, and he had seen creatures of every shape and size imaginable, and nothing had ever truly frightened him until the day the human ship appeared at the edge of Confederation territory. The vessel was crude by galactic standards, with rough metal plating and primitive engines that burned chemical fuel like something from ancient history. And Velthrix's science officers had almost dismissed the strange radio signals as stellar noise. But when the analysis confirmed artificial origin, the Confederation dispatched a greeting fleet. Commander Ethan Cole stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel Horizon and watched the alien ships surround his own, and he was a man of 42 years, with gray hair at his temples, and calm, steady eyes that had seen 2 decades of deep space exploration. 112 crew members, who represented the first humans to ever travel beyond their own solar system. "They are hailing us, sir," said Lieutenant Maria Santos from her communication station, and she was young and brilliant, with a gift for languages that had earned her this historic posting. The alien message took 3 days to decode, because their mathematical concepts were different, and their sound frequencies were outside normal human hearing range. But Maria worked without sleep until she finally cracked it. And when she did, she smiled wide and announced, "They want to meet us, Commander, and they are inviting us to their space station." Ethan nodded slowly and looked around at his crew and saw hope and fear and excitement on their faces, and he said, "Tell them we accept their invitation and prepare the shuttle for departure." The journey to the Karathi station took 6 hours, and the crew spent that time wondering what they would find, while others were thrilled, and Ethan himself felt a strange calm settle over him. Because after 20 years of wondering if humanity was alone in the universe, he was about to get his answer. The station hung in orbit around a massive blue gas giant, and its design was beautiful, with flowing curves and soft lights that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. And Ethan had never seen anything so elegant in his entire life. Velthrix waited in the docking bay with representatives from 6 other Confederation species, and each one looked different from the next, and there were beings with scales and beings with feathers and beings with more limbs than Ethan could count, and all of them watched the human shuttle with intense curiosity. The doors opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Ethan Cole stepped forward into alien territory with his hand extended in the universal gesture of peace that he hoped would translate across species. Every alien in that docking bay felt something they had not experienced in generations, and it was a deep primal fear that came from the oldest parts of their brains, and it screamed at them to run and hide. Ethan stood nearly 2 meters tall, with dense muscle packed onto his frame, and his eyes moved constantly, tracking every movement in the room with the focus of a predator. And when he smiled, his teeth were visible, including the sharp-pointed canines that marked him as a meat-eater. "On behalf of Earth and the United Human Coalition, we greet you in peace," Ethan said, and his voice was deep and confident. Velthrix forced himself to step forward, even though every instinct told him to flee, and he activated his translator device and said, "Welcome to the Galactic Confederation, and I am Ambassador Velthrix, and may I ask about your homeworld?" "Earth," Ethan replied proudly. "Third planet from our sun, with a mostly water surface and an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, and an average surface gravity of about 9.8 meters per second squared." Velthrix felt his 2 secondary hearts skip beats, and the number echoed in his mind, because it was impossible, and it was terrifying, and most habitable worlds in the known galaxy had gravity between 3 and 6 meters per second squared, and anything higher was classified as a death world, where no intelligent life could possibly evolve. "I apologize," Velthrix said carefully, "but did your translator malfunction? Because I thought you said 9.8. Ethan looked confused and said, "That is correct. And is something wrong with that number?" The other alien delegates began whispering urgently among themselves, and Velthrix could hear fragments of their panicked conversations, and words like impossible, and Deathworld, and predator species floated through the air. Maria Santos stepped up beside her commander and noticed the strange reactions, and she asked, "Ambassador Velthrix, can you explain why everyone seems so—" Velthrix took a long moment to compose himself, and then explained that in all their centuries of exploration, the Confederation had never encountered a sentient species from a world with gravity that high, and such planets were considered uninhabitable because the physical demands would crush any developing civilization. "We evolved there," Ethan said simply. "Our bodies adapted to handle it." A Meridian scientist named Chauvel approached with scanning equipment and asked permission to take readings, and Ethan agreed because he wanted to show good faith, and the results made Chauvel's tentacles tremble. "Their bone density is remarkable," Chauvel announced to the group, "and their musculature is incredibly efficient, and their cardiovascular system is designed for sustained exertion over long periods." Velthrix asked what kind of environment could produce such a species, and Ethan described Earth with its violent weather and tectonic instability, thousands of predator species that competed for resources, and the diseases that swept across continents, and the temperature extremes that could kill the unprepared. "And yet, your species survived all of that," Velthrix said, with something like awe in his voice. Ethan smiled again, and this time the expression seemed less threatening to the aliens, and more like pride, and he said, "We did more than survive, Ambassador, and we thrived, and we built civilizations, and we reached for the stars." The first formal meeting lasted 12 hours, and the humans answered thousands of questions about their biology and history and culture, and with each answer, the Confederation representatives grew more amazed and more concerned. They learned that humans could survive temperature ranges that would kill most galactic species, and they learned that humans consumed toxic substances like alcohol and caffeine for pleasure, and they learned that human bodies could heal from injuries without advanced medical technology. Medical intervention. And they learned that humans had once hunted prey by simply chasing it until it collapsed from exhaustion. "Your ancestors ran after animals until they died," Velthrix repeated, slowly trying to comprehend the horror of it. "Persistence hunting," Lieutenant Kevin Park explained, and he was the delegation's historian. "Our bodies were built for endurance, and we could keep going long after other creatures had to stop." That night, after the humans had returned to their ship, the Confederation Council met in emergency session, and the debate was fierce, with some arguing that humanity must be contained, and others insisting that peaceful species should be welcomed regardless of their origins. Velthrix listened to both sides, and he thought about Ethan Cole's calm confidence, and Maria Santos's brilliant smile, and Kevin Park's patient explanations, and he wondered if perhaps the galaxy had been wrong about what made a species dangerous. Eventually decided to offer humanity provisional membership with careful monitoring of their expansion, and no one present believed the Confederation could actually win a war against these Deathworld survivors. But they had to try something. In his private quarters that night, Velthrix wrote in his personal journal that he had witnessed the beginning of a new era, and that the galaxy would never be the same, and he did not know yet whether that would prove to be a blessing or a curse. Dr. Priya Sharma had been poked and prodded for 3 weeks straight, and she was getting tired of being treated like a laboratory specimen. But she understood that the aliens needed to study humanity, and so she sat patiently in the Karathi medical bay while strange instruments scanned every part of her body. The lead medical officer was a being called Thalmox, who resembled a 6-limbed insect with compound eyes that shifted colors based on his emotions, and right now those eyes were cycling through shades of orange, which Priya had learned meant extreme confusion. "Please explain this wound again," Thalmox said, while pointing at a small scar on Priya's forearm. I cut myself during maintenance work about 2 weeks ago, Priya explained. The skin broke, and there was some blood, but it has healed nicely, and I barely notice it anymore. Thalmox made a clicking sound that his translator rendered as disbelief, and he said, "You are telling me that your body repaired this damaged tissue without any medical intervention?" "That is correct," Priya confirmed. "Human bodies heal themselves from minor injuries, and this is completely normal for our species." The medical bay fell silent as the dozen alien scientists present tried to process this information, and several of them exchanged looks that Priya could not interpret. But she guessed they were somewhere between amazed and terrified. Over the following weeks, the Confederation conducted extensive studies on the entire human delegation, and each new discovery added to their growing understanding that humanity was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Priya submitted to blood tests that revealed her immune system actively hunted and destroyed foreign organisms, and the alien doctors were horrified to learn that humans carried beneficial bacteria inside their bodies, and that removing these helpful organisms would actually harm human health. Her ability to consume capsaicin by eating a spicy meal that would have hospitalized any Karathi, and she laughed while explaining that humans found the burning sensation pleasurable, and that millions of people back on Earth deliberately sought out the spiciest foods they could find. Commander Ethan Cole participated in physical endurance tests that left the alien observers speechless, and he ran on a treadmill for over 2 hours without stopping. And when the machines recorded his vital signs, they showed that his heart and lungs were barely stressed. Most species of our size could sustain such activity for perhaps 15 minutes, one scientist noted. And then they would require extended rest and possibly medical attention. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead and shrugged, and said humans are built for distance, and we can keep going all day if we need to. The cultural exchanges proved equally disturbing to the Confederation observers, and Lieutenant Kevin Park gave presentations on human history that made several delegates physically ill. He explained that humans had evolved in competition with thousands of other predator species, including large cats and bears, and wolves, and venomous snakes, and that early humans had been prey before they became hunters, and that this constant threat of death had shaped their psychology in fundamental ways. "Your ancestors were eaten by other animals?" Ambassador Velthrix asked during one session. "Frequently," Kevin confirmed. "Predators killed many of our kind, and disease killed even more, and natural disasters wiped out entire populations. And yet we kept growing and spreading, and eventually we reached the top of our food chain." Velthrix leaned forward, with curiosity overcoming his fear, and asked how such a soft and clawless species had managed to defeat creatures with natural weapons built into their bodies. Kevin smiled, and explained that humans had developed tools and weapons compensate for their physical limitations, and that they had learned to work together in groups, and that their greatest adaptation was their ability to think and plan and communicate complex ideas. "We hunted animals 10 times our size," Kevin said. "We did it by working as teams and by using our intelligence to outsmart creatures that were stronger and faster than us individually." The Confederation Council met again to discuss these findings, and the debate was even more heated than before, with some representatives arguing that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed freedom of movement, and others pointing out that the humans had shown nothing but peaceful intentions. Representative Chauvel of the Meridian Collective spoke passionately against trusting the Deathworlders, and he said, "Their entire evolutionary history is one of conflict and competition, and they killed their way to dominance on their home planet." Here, Ambassador Velthrix responded by noting that the humans had been cooperative and friendly, and that they had answered every question honestly, and that they seemed genuinely interested in peaceful relations. "For now," Chauvel countered, "but their nature will assert itself eventually, and when it does, we will all suffer." A Velthan delegate named Kirasol offered a different perspective, and she pointed out that the humans had also demonstrated remarkable capacity for cooperation and compassion, and that their pack-bonding instincts might actually make them valuable allies rather than threats. The debate continued for 5 standard days, and in the end, the Council decided to extend humanity's provisional membership for another 10 years, with continued monitoring and restrictions on their expansion into certain regions of space. Priya learned of this decision from Thalmox, who had become something like a friend during their many medical sessions. Tell that the insectoid doctor was conflicted about the Council's choice. "They fear you," Thalmox admitted, "and I understand why, because your capabilities are extraordinary, and your history is violent. But I have watched you closely for weeks now, and I have seen something that the Council seems to have missed." Priya asked what he meant, and Thalmox's eyes shifted to a soft blue color that indicated affection and trust. "You care about us," he said. "When I was struggling to understand your biology, you were patient and kind, and when my assistant made errors, you helped correct them gently, and you treated us as equals, even though your strength could easily overpower anyone on this station." Priya felt tears prick at her eyes, because she had not realized how much her behavior had meant to this alien scientist, and she reached out and touched his upper limb in a gesture of friendship that made Thalmox's eyes flash through several colors at once. "Humans are complicated," Priya said. "We can be violent and we can be cruel, but we can also love deeply and protect fiercely, and the same instincts that made our ancestors hunt also make us bond with others." Thalmox recorded this conversation in his personal research files and added a note that would later prove prophetic. And he wrote that perhaps the galaxy had been measuring danger by the wrong standards, and that true strength might lie not in the capacity for violence, but in the choice of when to use it. 5 years had passed since first contact, and humanity had spread across 12 worlds that other species had abandoned as too hostile for settlement, and they had built colonies on volcanic moons, and frozen wastelands, and jungle planets filled with predators, and they had thrived in places where the Confederation believed no one could survive. Captain Lisa Monroe commanded the human security contingent aboard Confederation Station 12, which served as a major trading hub at the intersection of 7 busy shipping lanes, and her team of 20 soldiers had become famous throughout the sector for their effectiveness and their willingness to help anyone in need. Lisa was 35 years old, with dark hair cut short for practicality, and a lean muscular frame that made her look exactly like what she was, which was a highly trained warrior. And her eyes were constantly moving and assessing threats, even when she appeared relaxed. "Captain, we have a situation in the lower markets," Sergeant Daniel Hayes reported as he rushed into her office, and his face was grim with concern. "What kind of situation?" Lisa asked, while already reaching for her sidearm. "Rillian smugglers have taken hostages," Daniel explained. 14 civilians, mostly Karathi merchants, and they have barricaded themselves in a warehouse. And Confederation security tried to negotiate, but the Rillians killed 3 hostages already. Lisa felt cold fury settle in her chest, because hostage-taking was one of the crimes she hated most, and she said, "Gather the team, and meet me at the warehouse in 10 minutes. The Rillians were a reptilian species known throughout the galaxy for their brutality and their complete lack of empathy for other beings. And they had claws that could slice through metal, and venom glands in their wrists that could paralyze victims with a single scratch. And most species avoided conflict with them at all costs. Found Karathi security officers maintaining a perimeter, and their commander was a nervous young officer who seemed relieved to see humans approaching. "Thank the stars you are here, Captain Monroe," he said. "We attempted negotiation 3 times, and each time they killed another hostage and demanded more money, and we do not know what else to do." Lisa studied the warehouse layout on her tactical display, and she noted the entry points and the likely positions of the smugglers and the probable locations where hostages were being held, and she made her decision quickly. "We stop negotiating," she announced. "My team will breach from 3 points simultaneously, and we will neutralize the Rillians and rescue the hostages." The Karathi commander looked horrified and said, "Captain, there are at least 20 Rillians in there, and they are armed, and they have natural weapons, and your team is only 20 humans." Lisa smiled in a way that made the Karathi officer step back, involuntarily, and she said, "20 humans is more than enough." The breach happened at exactly 1400 hours, station time, and Lisa led the first team through the main entrance, while Daniel took the second team through a side door, and Corporal Amy Walsh led the third team through a ceiling access point. The Rillians reacted instantly because their predator reflexes were among the fastest in the galaxy, and they turned toward the intruders with claws extended and venom dripping from their wrists, and they were confident that these soft-skinned humans would be easy prey. They were wrong. Lisa moved through the warehouse like a force of nature, and she fired 3 shots in rapid succession, dropping 3 Rillians before they could close to melee range. And when a fourth lunged at her, she sidestepped and drove her combat knife into the soft tissue under its jaw, and the creature fell without a sound. Daniel took a claw strike across his chest that opened a wound deep enough to show muscle and bone, and any other species would have collapsed from shock and blood loss. But Daniel shot his attacker twice, and then shot another Rillian that was approaching, and then kept fighting as if the injury meant nothing. Amy Walsh faced 2 Rillians at once, and one of them grabbed her arm with crushing force, but she twisted free and snapped the creature's limb at the joint, using a technique that human martial artists had perfected over thousands of years. And she used the broken arm as leverage to throw the Rillian into its companion, and both went down in a tangle of scales and fury. The battle lasted 30 seconds, and when it ended, 20 Rillians lay dead on the warehouse floor, and 11 hostages were alive and unharmed, and the human security team stood victorious, with wounds that would have killed members of any other species. Lisa found the hostages huddled in a corner and guarded by her soldiers, and when she approached, they looked at her with expressions of awe and terror and gratitude, all mixed together. "You are safe now," Lisa said gently. "Medical teams are on their way, and no one else is going to hurt you." An elderly Karathi merchant reached out with trembling limbs and touched Lisa's hand, and he said, "You saved us, and you did not have to risk yourselves for us, but you did." Lisa knelt down to meet his eyes and said, "Of course we did, because that is what we do." Word of the warehouse rescue spread across Confederation space within days, and the story grew with each retelling until it became almost legendary, and species who had feared humanity began to see them in a different light. Requests for human security details flooded into every human settlement, and cargo vessels wanted human crews, and mining operations wanted human supervisors, and diplomatic missions wanted human guards. And suddenly, the Deathworlders were the most sought-after protectors in the galaxy. Merchants who Lisa had saved started a tradition of calling her Shield-Bearer, and the name spread until it became her official title, and other human soldiers earned similar names from the aliens they protected. Daniel Hayes was called Ironheart after he continued fighting with a wound that should have killed him, and Amy Walsh was called Stormfist after witnesses described how she had broken Rillian limbs with her bare hands. And every human who served in security found themselves honored by the species they defended. Ambassador Velthrix observed these developments with growing understanding, and he began to see what he had missed during those first frightening days of contact. And he wrote in his journal that humanity's greatest weapon was not their strength or their resilience or their tolerance for pain. Their greatest weapon was their loyalty and their willingness to fight and die for beings who were not their own kind, and their pack bonding instinct that extended beyond species boundaries to embrace anyone they considered under their protection. The galaxy had spent 5 years fearing what humans might do if they turned violent, and they had failed to consider what humans would do when they chose to protect instead. Lisa Monroe continued her patrols of Station 12, and she treated every alien she met with the same respect and kindness that she showed to her own people. And she never understood why so many beings looked at her with something like worship in their eyes. Because to her, she was just doing her job. But the Confederation understood, and they began to realize that they had misjudged humanity completely, and that these Deathworld survivors were not the monsters they had feared, but something far more valuable. The Vex arrived without warning, and they tore through the fabric of space itself at the edge of human territory, and within hours, thousands of their bioships poured through the rift like a swarm of hungry insects. Admiral Richard Grant stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship Endurance and watched his sensor displays fill with hostile contacts. And he had served in the Navy for 30 years, and he had never seen anything like this. The Vex were not a species in any normal sense of the word, and they were a collective hive mind that consumed everything in their path, and absorbed the biological material of their victims into their own mass. And no one knew where they came from, and no one had ever defeated them. Confederation records showed 3 previous Vex incursions, and each one had ended the same way, with entire star systems sterilized before the swarm moved on to find new feeding grounds. Billions of lives had been lost, and nothing had stopped. Admiral, the Confederation fleet is retreating. Lieutenant Commander Grace Kim reported from her station, and her voice was tight with controlled fear. Richard watched the sensor display as the Allied ships turned and fled, and their faster engines allowed them to outrun the swarm. But that meant leaving 3 inhabited worlds directly in the path of the invasion. "How many people are on those planets?" Richard asked quietly. 6 billion combined, sir, and mostly Karathi and Meridian and Velthan civilians, with about 200,000 human colonists, she replied. Richard closed his eyes for a moment and thought about his wife back on Earth, and his 2 daughters, who were just starting their own careers, and he thought about all the aliens who had welcomed humanity into the Confederation, and who had learned to trust the Deathworlders despite their fear. He opened his eyes and looked around his bridge at the men and women who served under him, watching him and waiting for orders, and not one of them looked away. "All ships form defensive line," Richard commanded. "We hold here until evacuation is complete." The human fleet consisted of 47 vessels with 18,000 crew members, and it was a tiny force compared to the endless swarm of Vex bioships. But it was all that stood between the monsters and 6 billion innocent lives. Richard opened a communication channel to his entire fleet, and his voice was steady and calm, because panic would kill them faster than the enemy. "You all know what we are facing, and the Confederation thinks we are already dead, and maybe they are right, but those planets behind us have billions of people counting on us to buy them time." He paused and looked at the faces around him, and saw fear and determination and pride all mixed together. "We are the line, and we do not break, and we do not run, and we do not die quietly. And humanity, show them what a death world produces." LP. The battle began at 1500 hours, and it would continue for 17 hours of unrelenting horror. The first wave of Vex bioships crashed against the human line, and their organic hulls absorbed weapons fire that would have destroyed metal vessels, and they spat acid and launched swarms of smaller attack drones, and they kept coming, no matter how many fell. The Endurance took heavy damage in the first hour, and 3 of its sister ships were destroyed outright, and the humans fought back with everything they had, and they used tactics that no other species would consider. Captain Marcus Webb of the destroyer Valiant rammed his crippled vessel into the core of a Vex command ship, and the resulting explosion destroyed both vessels and took out 6 more bioships in the blast radius. And his final transmission was simply, "For Earth." Lieutenant Commander Grace Kim flew her fighter directly into the primary nerve cluster of a carrier-sized Vex organism. and she ejected at the last possible second and drifted in the void for 6 hours while the battle raged around her. And when rescue teams finally reached her, she was laughing and asked if she could go back out. Chief Engineer Paul Martinez held a breached corridor against Vex boarding drones for 40 minutes, with nothing but a welding torch and his refusal to die. And when ammunition ran out, he used the torch as a weapon and burned through dozens of the creatures until reinforcements arrived. Corporal Nathan Lee lost both legs to a Vex claw beast that breached the lower decks, and any other being would have died from shock and blood loss. But Nathan crawled 200 meters across the floor, dragging himself with his arms, until he reached an engineering console. He entered the commands to vent the entire compartment into space, and the atmosphere rushed out, carrying 30 Vex invaders with it. And medical teams found him 3 hours later, still alive and still conscious. And his first words were asking about the status of the battle. The Endurance was a floating wreck by hour 12, with half its systems offline, and fires burning on multiple decks. And Admiral Grant commanded from an auxiliary bridge after the main one was destroyed, and he refused evacuation, and refused to retreat, and refused to die. "Status report," he demanded through gritted teeth, while blood ran down his face from a head wound that should have killed him. "We have lost 23 ships, sir, and the Vex advance has slowed significantly. And evacuation transports report 70% of civilians are away." Richard nodded and said, "Then we keep fighting." At hour 17, when reinforcements finally arrived from 18 different Confederation species, the human line was still holding, and barely. The combined fleet swept through the Vex formation with fresh ships and full ammunition, and they pushed the swarm back and back and back until the rift collapsed and the invasion ended. Admiral Grant stood on his shattered bridge, surrounded by wreckage and wounded crew, and he opened a communication channel and transmitted one final message. "Line held, and evacuation complete, and you are welcome." 8,000 human soldiers died in those 17 hours, and half the fleet was destroyed, and the survivors were injured and exhausted beyond anything they had experienced before. But 6 billion lives were saved because humanity chose to stand when everyone else chose to run. The galaxy would never forget what the Deathworlders did that day, and they would never again question whether humanity belonged among the stars. They had earned their place with blood and sacrifice, and the kind of stubborn refusal to surrender that only a species forged on a death world could possess. The memorial on New Geneva took 3 years to build, and it rose 200 meters into the sky as a spire of black granite, carved with the names of every human who died stopping the Vex invasion, and it stood as a permanent reminder of the price humanity paid to protect the galaxy. The dedication ceremony drew representatives from every species in the Confederation, and millions more watched through broadcast networks, and it was the largest gathering in galactic history. Ambassador Velthrix attended despite his advanced age, and his carapace had turned gray, and his movements were slow, but he had insisted on being present because he owed a debt to humanity that could never be fully repaid. Beside him stood Admiral Lisa Monroe, who had been promoted twice since the warehouse rescue that made her famous, and her uniform was decorated with medals from a dozen different species, and gray now streaked through her dark hair, but she still carried herself like the soldier she is. "Had always been. I owe you an apology," Velthrix said quietly as they watched human children playing on the memorial grounds. Lisa raised an eyebrow and asked, "For what exactly?" "When we first met your species, I was afraid, and we all were, and we thought you were monsters waiting to turn your violence against us, and we spent years watching you, and waiting for you to reveal your true nature." Velthrix paused, and his compound eyes shifted to a deep blue color. "We were wrong about you." Lisa smiled and said, "You are not entirely wrong, Ambassador, because we are violent, and we come from a world that taught us to fight or die. but we also come from a world that taught us something else. What is that? Lisa looked up at the memorial spire and the thousands of names carved into its surface, and she said, "That family is not just about blood, and it is about who stands beside you when everything falls apart. And your people became our family the moment you welcomed us, and the whole Confederation did." Velthrix considered this for a long moment, and he thought about his own species, and how they chose their bonds, and how different it was from the human way, but also how similar in the things that mattered most. "The Council has reached a decision," he announced. "Full membership for humanity, with no restrictions, and you will have a permanent seat on the governing body." Lisa nodded slowly and said, "That took long enough." "There is more," Velthrix continued, and he reached into his ceremonial robes and withdrew a small device that fit in the palm of his hand. "This is a beacon, and it will summon human ships from anywhere in Confederation space, and every member world will receive one." Lisa took the device and examined it carefully and asked, "You want us to be your protectors?" "We want you to be our partners," Velthrix replied. "Our family, as you would say, and you showed us that monsters can be heroes. Worlders can be guardians, and let us show you that we learned the lesson." Lisa looked at the beacon and then at the memorial, and then at the old ambassador who had feared her kind so many years ago, and who now trusted them with the survival of his people. "Deal," she said simply. The ceremony continued with speeches from leaders of every major species, and each one acknowledged the debt they owed to humanity, and each one pledged to honor the sacrifice of those who died. Dr. Priya Sharma spoke about the early days of contact, and how suspicious the aliens had been, and how patient the humans had tried to be. And she described the moment when Thalmox had first called her a friend, and how that single word had meant more to her than any scientific discovery. Thalmox was in the audience, and his compound eyes shifted through colors that had no translation, but that everyone understood meant deep emotion. Lieutenant Commander Grace Kim spoke about the battle against the Vex, and her voice cracked when she mentioned the pilots who did not come back, and she told stories of impossible courage and stubborn refusal to surrender that made the alien delegates weep in their various ways. Admiral Richard Grant did not speak because he had died of his wounds 3 months after the battle, but his daughters read a letter he had written to be shared at the memorial. In that letter, he wrote about what it meant to be human, and about the fire that burned in their hearts, and about the choice that every person faced when darkness came. He wrote that humans were not special because they were strong or fast or resilient, and that they were special because they chose to stand between the innocent and the harm that threatened them, and they did it knowing they might not survive. He wrote that this choice was the true measure of humanity, and that as long as humans continued to make it, then their species deserved to walk among them. The memorial ceremony ended at sunset, and the spire was illuminated by thousands of lights that made it glow against the darkening sky, and families gathered to trace the names of loved ones carved into the stone. Lisa Monroe walked among them, and she stopped to speak with widows and orphans, and she held hands and wiped tears, and she promised that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Velthrix watched her from a distance, and he finally understood what made humanity different from every other species the Confederation had encountered. It was not their strength, or their endurance, or their ability to survive impossible conditions, and it was not even their willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. It was their love. They loved fiercely and protectively, and they extended that love to anyone who needed it, and they would burn worlds to protect the people they cared about, and they would die smiling if it meant keeping their family safe. Galaxy had feared them because they came from a death world, but the galaxy had learned to rely on them because their hearts were as strong as their bodies. In the years that followed, humanity spread across the Confederation, and they built colonies and established trade routes, and served as guardians for species who had never known true safety. They remained what they had always been, which was the children of a death world, forged in violence and tempered by hardship, and bound by a loyalty that transcended species. The galaxy had feared them, and now it loved them, and humanity, as always, rose to meet whatever challenge came next. Because that was who they were, and that was what Deathworlders did. They survived, and they protected, and they never ever gave up.